Good evening and welcome to episode 9 of our Garden States Microdose monthly webcast, leading us ever closer to December's event, our Garden States webcast, which will be a fundraising event helping to raise funds for Entheogenesis Australis in support of the many projects, some of which you'll hear about tonight, that EGA has been engaged with, even over lockdown, as lockdown comes to an end. And I hope that you have got to see tonight's sunset. Wow, it was incredible. If you are here in Melbourne, if you're joining us from elsewhere, then welcome, and thank you for being here for our EGA webcast. I'm broadcasting tonight from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and would like to pay my respects to elders past and present, as well as anyone who may be tuned in today. I'd also like to recognise that we benefit from the knowledge and insights of First Nations peoples here in Australia, and people around the world as well, including their long relationships with the plants and fungi that we often revere, especially here on the EGA webcast. I acknowledge that knowledge of First Nations people has often been obtained disrespectfully, and call on our community to understand and recognise different cultural protocols and show our respect and gratitude for those. Sovereignty was never ceded. My name is Nick Wallace, and I'm the co-founder of the Australian Psychedelic Society and currently head up the Melbourne chapter. If you want to find out more about what we're up to as we're sort of gearing up to do events again, you can find that at psychedelicsociety.org.au, and our moderators who are in the YouTube comment section tonight will also be putting up links and putting up information there. And if you'd like to drop where you're tuning in from tonight, we'd love to hear where you're joining us from. EGA is closing in now on its 20th year. They say 2004. I know from speaking with these guys for a long time that there were, although the organisation was incorporated in 2004, the organisation existed before then. So closing in on 20 years of official operations of EGA, providing opportunities for critical thinking and knowledge sharing on the interface between plants, fungi, mind and culture. EGA embraced the psychedelic in the broadest sense of the word and beyond into science, culture, policy, and nurturing our communal undergrowth that holds all of this together. Is it grassroots or is it mycelium? And I don't need to put roots at the end. It's not an ATM machine, is it? Also, I'd like to, not that one, raffle, the EGA raffle, where there will be more announcements about EGA's raffle coming up soon, but you can find out about it here at the website, gardenstates.entheogenesis.org/raffle donations. That's for if you would like to make a donation. Of course, the raffle is a fantastic opportunity to get your hands on some pretty unique ethnobotanical items, whether it's books, plants, clothing or jewellery. There's a whole range of stuff available. As I've mentioned before, the Garden States December event, which was intended to be an in-person event, but because up until the past week or so, where a lot of action seems to have been happening and we're getting announcements all the time, it's been very difficult to actually organise something with confidence, and EGA wants to be able to present an in-person event with confidence to you. So with that in mind, we have now issued everybody who has an EGA Garden States event ticket with a free ticket for our upcoming December webcast, an all-day forum for cultivating ethnobotanical plants, knowledge and psychedelics community with a range of speakers, which you can find out more about at the gardenstates.org website. And it is, as I mentioned before, a fundraiser, really important to raise funds for Entheogenesis Australis to help us with some of the projects that we have been up to. And you can find out about all that's going on with EGA by signing up for the newsletter at entheogenesis.org/connect, and you can also find us on social media there. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about, and we will be talking a little bit about in the second part of tonight's webcast, is the resources that are available at entheogenesis.org/resources. One of them, I realise that's not the correct slide. I do have another slide, but this is one of the ones that was released recently on the Peyote Conservation Conservation reference guide, peyote being an under threat species, and what you can do to support this species that is under threat. There's a lot of other resources at the Entheogenesis website, so please do check it out there. And before we go on to tonight's event, I just want to let you know what we'll be doing next month. Next month, we'll be hearing about the safeguarding the genetic diversity of the psilocybe species, Psilocybe subaeruginosa and P. cubensis in Australia. Although we do acknowledge there are other psilocybe species, these are the most common species in Australia. And we'll be hearing from Alastair, Dr. Alastair McTaggart. Alastair studies the evolution of fungal pathogens with a focus on rust and smut fungi. I'm sure somebody will tell me what smut fungi is in the comments. Please, mycologists, I'd love to know. He has completed postdocs in Africa, America and Europe, and Alastair has started a new research direction for University of Queensland studying the biodiversity of native psychoactive mushrooms in Australia. That's next month. You can sign up for it again at the Garden States address, and keep up to date with everything else coming from Entheogenesis Australis. So thank you all for joining us for tonight's webcast. And I'll remind you again, our moderators are in the comments section of YouTube here, and you can leave your questions, your comments. If it's a question for our speaker, you can put it in there at any time, and we will collate those for a Q&A following our speaker's presentation tonight. Or if you have, if you want links to resources, if you need information about anything that I've mentioned, please do ask our moderators. That's what they're there for. And as always, the conversation continues on social media after this event. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter, and continue that conversation in comment sections, or just by keeping up to date on what articles are coming out and what information is coming out. There's a lot going on at the moment, and we're going to hear about some of that tonight with Dr. Jonathan Brett, who is our guest speaker. Dr. Jonathan is presenting tonight on methamphetamine to psychedelics and back again. It's a research project he's involved with at St Vincent's, studying psilocybin psychotherapy for methamphetamine dependence, and reviewing reviewing important research studies relevant to this work. Jonathan will also discuss the current state of Australian psychedelic research, and will conclude by taking questions at the end. Jonathan is a clinical pharmacology, toxicology and addiction medicine specialist at St Vincent's Hospital in Sydney, and a clinical toxicologist at New South Wales Poisons Information Centre. He is a conjoint associate professor at St Vincent's Clinical School at UNSW and a NHRMC research fellow at the Centre for Big Data Research in Health at UNSW. His research interests lie in developing new treatments and models of care in addiction medicine, and I'll welcome Jonathan now. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thanks, Nick. Very kind of you. Thanks for having me along. Just to acknowledge that, I'm talking to you from Sydney here. I'm on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past and present here, and also recognise the land was never ceded. Thanks so much for the invitation to talk. And for the very generous introduction there. So I'm ultimately going to talk to you about our study, but I thought before then we'd just wander through a bit of history and a bit of background, and talk a bit about where we are up to with sort of the research landscape in Australia at the moment. So I suspect a lot of this won't be new for you, but it's nice to kind of wander through it anyway. So when we're talking about psychedelic facilitated psychotherapy, it's really easy to wander into metaphors very quickly. And there are many, but one I sort of particularly like is this sort of mountain climbing metaphor, where a therapist is really helping someone to climb the mountain, to get to the top, to see the beautiful views. So in this, it's a real it's a real synergy between the therapist and the drug, and it's also acknowledging that it does require some hard work on the part of the person, the patient and the therapist, but ultimately, hopefully, it's worth it to get to the top to see the views. So, what does psychedelic mean? So it means mind or soul manifesting. And it's the best thing we have at the moment to describe this area, I think. So just to say that psychedelics have been around for an extremely long time, as you're probably aware. Some of the earliest documented experiences with psychedelics are, from 5000 BC, relating to, this shaman with an interesting mushroom head. And then, throughout the centuries since then, there's been fossils of peyote found, and you're probably familiar with these amazing stone mushroom statues that come from Central and South America. So, going to talk a bit about the sort of, historical rise and fall. So obviously this is modern day rise because, as we've seen, psychedelics have been around for a long time and seem to have played a fairly substantial role in human history and spiritual rituals and so on. But this is the sort of modern rise. So I imagine all of you have heard of Albert Hoffman, who first synthesized LSD. Very fascinating story about how he got there. And again, was sort of later credited with being the first person to synthesize psilocybin and psilocin in a laboratory as well. So he's working for Sandoz at the time, and they end of the 40s, started to treat a variety of mental health disorders. Obviously, that was, pre-DSM, so it was a lot looser than what it is now. But then, a few interesting things happened. The CIA began to experiment with this. But a lot of the modern perceptions of psychedelics have really been shaped by this really seminal book by Aldous Huxley called Doors of Perception, after some experience with mescaline, popularization of psychedelics and psychedelic experience. So, then Sandoz started to market it. So they were some of the first to start to bring research into mainstream in this area in the 1960s. Sadly, they were fired shortly after for a number of reasons. We documented entering the street scene as a sort of recreational drug as well. So after a brief, sort of couple of decades spurt of activity with research and so on, then the fall of psychedelics began. Probably a number of reasons. The reason that's popularized is this one here, but I'll touch on another one. So, there was a sort of confluence of things happening in the late 60s, early 70s. There was concerns that certain people were, rather than, restricting the use of psychedelics to research, were popularizing the use of psychedelics in a sort of wider social context. The common story is that then, at that time, Richard Nixon was trying to recruit people for the Vietnam War, and there was real concerns around the destabilization of the institution and society with psychedelics sort of becoming mainstream. And, around that time was when the war on drugs started. Really started initially with cannabis, but, psychedelics were sort of an easy target as well, I think, because of all this stuff going on. And then, they also received like a bit of negative press with, through popular media as well. And, were then banned legally sort of shortly after. The other thing that was going on at the time was actually the FDA was really tightening up the process by which clinical trials were approved and drugs could be approved. And because of these restrictions, a lot of drug companies actually just got out of the game. It just wasn't looking like it was going to be possible to actually run these trials for them because of the regulation, the regulated environment at the time. So, what drugs are we actually talking about? They act on the serotonin system, 5-HT system. Historically, they've been called hallucinogens, but I think more recently they're called psychedelics. So LSD and psilocybin, I'm sure everyone's familiar with, as you probably are with DMT. Combine that with harmaline. The classical psychedelics predominantly act on the 5-HT2A receptor, but do actually probably act on a bunch of other serotonin receptor subtypes, plus probably some other receptors there as well. The interesting thing is that I'm not sure whether there's any sort of pharmacologists online. They seem to have pretty interesting sort of actions at the receptor in that they're partial agonists and possibly bias agonists as well. If anyone wants me to talk more about that, I can do in questions. But that might be the reason for some of their talked about that. Yeah, so you kind of seem to get effects from about 20 micrograms, but psychedelic dose is anywhere between 100 and 200 micrograms. Lots of different species. Again, it's 5-HT2A agonist. The psychedelic dose, most research is actually used to your systemic circulation, and it's metabolized to its active metabolite psilocin, and then further broken down by monoamine oxidase. So where about 160 minutes, psilocin 50, the duration of effect is about 4 to 8 hours. So most studies these days are actually using psilocybin. Most studies of macrodosing psychedelic psychotherapy are using psilocybin. And this is probably the reason why, because it's slightly easier to work with. So this is a graph of intensity against time. And you can see, similar peak, but psilocybin seems to peak a bit earlier. And then has implications for a number of reasons. Having therapists there for extremely long time is obviously more costly, but also, people knowing they're not going to have care of kind of all the studies that are going on with psychedelics at the moment. Again, it's 2017 and it's already incredibly out of date. There's a lot going on. There's actually hundreds of trials registered with trials.gov. I'm not going to cover them all, but I am just going to touch on a few related to addiction because that's kind of my area of interest. So again, some of these studies are quite old. So if you look at this meta-analysis of studies looking at LSD for alcohol dependence or alcoholism, they call it here, you sort of smallish studies, but when combined gives you a bit more power. They did see pretty reliable improvements in drinking, initially in up to about 6 months, but that waned at about 12 months. Now, most of those studies were actually performed in the early 70s. And so we think that now with our current treatment paradigms for alcohol dependence, it may be that the results are different. And in fact, someone called Michael Bogenschutz is probably the lead, done the most work in alcohol dependence and psilocybin psychotherapy. So published to date is this sort of small proof of concept trial of 10 people where they showed really significant decreases in percentage drinking and percentage heavy drinking days. He has actually subsequently performed a much larger study, which I understand is hot in press and showed very positive results as well. So we're waiting to see the results of that. again, for opioid dependence, there was a study, again, quite an old study now, of LSD for people in rehab recovering from opioid dependence. And you could see, pretty small study, but substantial difference between the groups there as well. And there's also been a small single-arm study of smoking cessation. And again, pretty impressive results, like more than we'd see for any of the other pharmacotherapies, really, up, out to 16 months or more. So what's going on in Australia? So to name a few of things that are actually sort of started or about to start, we're kind of in a lucky position at St Vincent's because St Vincent's Melbourne did a lot of the work for us, that, and we kind of were able to piggyback a bit on the back of that. But there's a study, I think, more than halfway through, recruiting for people with end-of-life anxiety. So palliative care and psilocybin psychotherapy there. There's a study kind of about to start recruiting for treatment-resistant depression, and a study in the works for generalized anxiety as well. So the study that I'm leading is one for methamphetamine use disorder, and there's also a study at St Vincent's Hospital for treatment-resistant depression, where we're looking at leaving people on the psychotropics. And I'm happy to talk a little bit about that, but it's not my study, so I better not say too much. So we're at a really interesting nexus in Australia in terms of the capacity and government support to actually do this research. So the government did release $15 million in what we call an MRFF funding scheme. And so the results of that are really imminently due to be released. And so there's a lot of people waiting on the edge of their seat, and we'll know a lot more in the next month or so what the landscape's going to look like in terms of research for psychedelics once they're released. So what's the rationale for using psychedelic psychotherapy or psilocybin psychotherapy for methamphetamine use disorder? So, the first thing to say is that, there's between 200,000 and 300,000 people living with methamphetamine use disorder in the country. And people living with this do experience very high burden of disease, as do often the experience of people around them. So we really don't have, many effective treatments. There's no well-proven pharmacological treatments, and the mainstay of care is really psychological talking therapies and rehab, and the outcomes aren't particularly impressive from either of those either. So there's a real need for better treatment for people with methamphetamine use disorder. So there's actually, like I've said, there's existing evidence that psilocybin psychotherapy is pretty effective across a number of things. And the things that it is effective for, it has a very large effect size, very rapid response, and you only have to give the therapy within a fairly limited time frame, and it's overwhelmingly safe when it's used in a therapeutic setting. So the interesting thing about psilocybin psychotherapy is that it may actually cause us to rethink how we think about mental health and how we diagnose mental health, because what we're finding is that this modality of treatment seems to be transdiagnostic, and so it actually seems to address features underlying these conditions like mood disorders, depression, anxiety, addiction, that span, that are common to all these disorders. And, I'll put in the blue circle there in the middle, methamphetamine use disorder, but actually, in a way, this, could be any of those disorders. So people often experience social disconnection that's really a spiral, that's self-enforcing, a decrease in mental flexibility, constant rumination and self-referential thoughts, so thinking sort of bad about yourself and the world, and a decreased ability to mentalize, so a decreased ability to put oneself in other people's shoes. So, how do we sort of think that psilocybin psychotherapy actually works? Well, there's still a lot of research sort of ongoing in this area, but we do know that social disconnection, impairments, and mental flexibility are really, like I said, at the core of addiction. And the psychedelic experience is one of real connectedness and increases in psychological flexibility. There's also strong expectancy effects. So, what people expect to happen often does happen. There's also a bunch of psychodynamic theories of consciousness that feed into this as well. But essentially, the sort of general gist of this is you're creating a state that's highly neuroplastic and highly suggestible. And so one way of conceptualizing it is thinking of consciousness as a series of peaks and troughs. And those peaks and troughs are really our values, and how deep they are depends on how weighted those values are. So how strongly we hold them. What psychedelics do, one theory of what they do is they flatten the landscape to allow us to not have to rely so strongly on those weightings, and to be able to sort of have a bit more flexibility, and to be able to shift our beliefs about certain things a bit more easily. So there's lots of different phenomenology of psychedelic experience, but this is the one that I quite like. Again, it's all about connection, intuitive knowledge, transcendence, deeply positive mood. So you can see how all these things are potentially pretty helpful for people with these issues, problems. So there's also really quite compelling evidence that come from Neuro Imaging as well. So again, Robin Carhart-Harris has done a lot of work here, but in addiction, we used to think, the reward circuit, the limbic pathways were, really the most important thing going on there. But actually, we're finding that there's a lot of other really important networks in addiction, and probably mental health as well, actually. One central one being the default mode network. And the concept is that this network is really sort of helping you. It's kind of the one theory is it's the seat of ego, so it's the sense of self, and it helps you mentally time travel sort of backwards and forwards. And so people with addictions or mental health problems often have, when you image their brain, dysregulation of this network. And so for the front part, you get decreased activity there. And so basically what that leads to is emotional dysregulation and low self-esteem, and you get an increase in the activity of the posterior part, which leads to, and this is very, very basic, boiling it down, increasing rumination, self-referential thoughts, and decreased ability to mentalize. So what studies have found is actually that what psilocybin does is actually, it sort of remediates some of that that sort of low and high activity in the anterior and posterior centers. But essentially, it also increases the connection of the default mode network to all your other brain networks. So it really increases connectivity in the brain. And it also increases neuroplasticity. And by that, I mean, the actual growth of dendrites, the growth of neurons, and the linking of, lots of networks together. We also know that, actually some mental health conditions and certainly some addictions, particularly psychostimulant abuse, are neuroinflammatory. And there's some evidence that, and there's also evidence in these other kind of pathways like the kynurenine pathway that they're quite abnormal in addiction as well. And actually there's some early evidence that psychedelics can help redress some of those problems as well. So what does it actually look like? So the classic macrodosing psychedelic psychotherapy. I'm happy to talk a bit about microdosing as well, if anyone's interested at the end, because I'm also involved in a study there. But the classic macrodosing study uses at its foundation, most commonly, this thing called the set-and-setting protocol. And this was sort of written about by Roland Griffith in a really good paper, like outlining what the safety aspects of psychedelic psychotherapy are. And so really at the core of that is study personnel and the therapist dyad. So the therapy is always delivered by this couple of therapists, and historically that was for both practical reasons, because you were sitting with someone for 8 hours and occasionally you might need to go to the toilet or eat, but also for psychodynamic reasons. Historically it was usually a man and a woman to represent sort of mother and father. I think we're moving away from that now, because I think because it's quite gender binary, and we're acknowledging that it doesn't have to be the case. But I think having two therapists is generally sort of common practice. Setting is really important. So what people realize early on is whenever you deliver this kind of therapy, it really needs to be in a very sort of comfortable, loungy space, like the one you can see here. So really not your typical sort of clinical setting. So it is quite fun when you're setting up these rooms. In fact, my sense is like, why don't we do this all the time with hospitals? Because it's a much nicer environment. So generally, the way this works is you have a few sessions of psychotherapy before you actually have your dose of psilocybin. And in those therapy sessions, you're really developing a relationship or a therapeutic alliance with the patient. You're helping them set intentions, or what do you want to get out of this, and helping them with motivation and providing psychoeducation. So what's actually going to happen during the dosing day and what might happen afterwards. People then, when there's a sense that they're ready, people then come back for the dosing day, where they spend 8 hours with the two therapists after having taken the psilocybin. Generally, they're laid on a sofa with an eye mask on and sort of very carefully curated soundtrack during that experience. And then after that, they have a number of sessions of integration psychotherapy, which is really kind of helping them make sense of the experience, particularly in the context of their intentions, and planning for the sort of what next, and making the most of that period of neuroplasticity. So what's our study? So our study is really just a very small study of 15 people as a single arm study recruited from our stimulant treatment program. And the reason it's small is because it's the first in the world study to actually do this for this indication. And so we had a sense of really sort of going slow and being careful. So with that in mind, we've spent a lot of time thinking about who might be eligible for this study. So it's people with methamphetamine use disorder who are using less than 16 days or less in a month, and greater than 25 years, and no personal family history of psychosis. Look, the reason we chose a lot of these things was really to just be very careful around psychosis, even though stimulant psychosis is probably a different entity to your, the kind of experience you have with psychedelics, but there's a real need to sort of be careful in this area. So the main thing we're trying to get out of this is really to sort of demonstrate safety and feasibility, but we're also measuring a number of other outcomes there related to drug use, quality of life. We're scanning people's brains before and after and looking at changes in network activity. And we're looking at a range of biomarkers, like looking at inflammation and the kynurenine pathway. So this is what it looks like. So there's people go through 3 screening visits just to make sure they're definitely eligible. They then have a qualitative interview, scans, biomarkers. We then do the prep psychotherapy. So we're saying at least 3 sessions there. They then come in for their dose, have another brain scan, more psychotherapy, and then we follow them up 3 months from the dosing day. So, probably you've all come across these resources before. MAPS is an excellent organization, predominantly interested in MDMA, but have a number of other interests. And I'm sure you've probably heard of Michael Pollan's book there as well. So just like to acknowledge all the investigators on this study. Really couldn't have done it without them. Big shout out to Paul and Marg there. And NCRED for the National Centre for Clinical Research on Emerging Drugs, and St Vincent's Clinic for funding the study as well. So at that point, I'm happy to stop and take any questions.
Well, thank you, Jonathan, so far, and we will get our questions from the comment section. So please do drop in any questions that you do have. And Jonathan, if you want to stop sharing your screen, we'll get a nice big image of you there. Excellent. So our first question, I've noticed that Dr. Stephen Bright is here. He's Vice President of PRISM, Psychedelic Research in Science and Medicine. And also, first of all, didn't realise that there was a study for TRD. I assume that's an acronym relating to your study at St Vincent's, but wanted to know more about the differences in, and he's given me a whole bunch of acronyms here, so the differences in PAP for SUD versus PAP for TRD. So if you can pull apart those acronyms for us and, and give us that.
Well, first of all, I'll say hi, Stephen. It's very kind of you to join, and thanks for the question. So PAP is, I presume, psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, and MUD is methamphetamine use disorder, and TRD is treatment-resistant depression. So, I mean, that's a good question. I probably shouldn't say too much about our study for treatment-resistant depression because I'm not the principal investigator on that. But what I will say is that the problem or the difficulty with a lot of these studies is there's a lot of moving parts in these studies, and we don't know the relative importance of each of them. So, for example, there's the dose of psilocybin, there's the number of dosing sessions, there's the dose of psychedelic psychotherapy, there's a dose of preparation, integration psychotherapy, and so we don't know across the different indications what's going to be, if it's going to be the same across indications, or whether there's going to be a need to sort of tailor for those indications. So for the psychedelic, for methamphetamine use disorder, actually for all of them, my sense is you probably do need more than one dose. And given that most trials have tried 25 milligrams before with some effect, that's it's probably close to where it's going to be. The issue with treatment-resistant depression is if you're leaving people on their meds, is one of on the psychotropic meds is one of both possibly dose blunting, but also increased sort of risk of toxicity. So then, it does need a slightly different trial to look at that, and more of a sort of dose titration trial rather than a single dose trial to look at that. That's probably all I can say about that study. But there's a lot of there's probably more similarities than differences across indications, but there's a need to sort of tailor treatments to particular indications probably, but we just don't know yet.
So what sorts of challenges were there in getting this study approved?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. I mean, I anticipated a lot more challenges than there actually were. So we were in a really lucky position, like I said, at St Vincent, Sydney, that St Vincent's Melbourne had already done a lot of the hard work for us, getting it through, the network bioethics committee and getting approval from the CEO, which, we're incredibly grateful for. So when it came to getting approval, we also had an excellent team that had all the sort of required expertise, and we're based in a hospital, which made things a lot easier. Getting across ethics was actually not as hard as I thought, and that's because our ethics committee were prepared to look at this as not as a sort of psychedelic with a lot of historical baggage, but as a chemical entity that required research, and to consider it as any other chemical entity that wasn't TGA registered. and was in a highly sort of controlled research environment. So ethics was fine, easy. What's been a bit more challenging is that actually getting the drug in the country. So the company that were, there's not many companies that actually manufacture and distribute psilocybin, and the ones that do have been absolutely inundated because of the massive explosion in psychedelic research, and so there's a real backlog, and so that's been our major sort of bottleneck of getting things off the ground, really. Otherwise, we would be recruiting by now.
And how do you make sure participants think a placebo might be a psychedelic? An issue that I know has been at the heart of a lot of psychedelic research, especially where double blinds are needed, ever since there has been psychedelic research.
Yeah, really, really tough question. So there's a lot of thought gone into how we can actually do this, and one of the problems is that historically, to get drugs registered with the TGA and then PBS listing, you do need to perform certain types of trials, and that's a randomized double-blind controlled trial. I mean, the problem is that it's very, very hard to blind these kind of trials because either through personal experience or experience of popular culture, people are kind of aware of the experience they're going to have, and if you give anything other than a psychedelic, then there's a very good chance they're going to know. So there's been various approaches to this kind of issue. Giving a lower dose of the psychedelic psilocybin compared to sort of a psychedelic dose, giving other things that might be sedatives like benzodiazepines, or sedative/stimulants like dextromethorphan, or just stimulants like caffeine. There's no easy answer here. Other pragmatists are actually just saying, look, there's no way we can actually blind this. So we're going to actually do a clinical effectiveness trial where we compare this modality of psychotherapy against the thing that we think is probably the best current thing in the field. So short course CBT, or CBT plus contingency management, like an addiction treatment. So there's really a shift towards rethinking how we sort of do these trials and how we structure these trials. But it's still evolving. I'm not sure we've quite nailed it yet.
Something that, yes, an evolving area, especially with such obvious psychoactive effect. Keep those questions coming in the comment section, and thank you to those who have asked one so far. What do you think of mystical experiences in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy? That's PAP. Thank you, acronyms, for substance use disorder. The Bill Richards model used for nicotine dependence relied heavily on these experiences being mystical experiences.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good question. So there's certain things we measure. So we measure the mystical experiences questionnaire, and we think of it's a composite of different constructs, that questionnaire, but we think it's really, really important to have a mystical experience because a lot of the studies have actually demonstrated that that's the reason why, or that's really very much linked to the positive outcomes for these indications. So there's pretty good papers to demonstrate that. There's also Peter Hendricks is another researcher in this area. He's recently just finished recruiting for a trial of psilocybin psychotherapy PAP for cocaine dependence, and he's written, or he thinks a lot about the sense of the experience of awe as an effect mediator as well. So really, that being wow, and I'm very small, and your sense of your position in the universe being that ultimate sense of perspective and awe being an effect modifier as well. But yeah, I mean, look, there's pretty good evidence now to show that the link between mystical experience and outcomes. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very interesting area as well, because there is so much. I mean, it seems like a really hard area to measure. Although, as you've mentioned, there are a few questionnaires that have been used throughout some of the research to effect. What can clinical use of psychedelics? What can clinical use of psychedelics learn from natural? What can we learn in the clinical use of psychedelics from natural or indigenous use?
Well, a lot. Sadly, we're often, 2 or 3 steps behind, things that are actually really helpful. I mean, mindfulness is a good example of that as well. It took, don't know how long for, Western medicine to cotton on to that, and the Buddhists have been doing it for centuries. So what can we learn? Well, I suppose what we have learned is the importance of set and setting, and really getting that right. There's interesting. I mean, I'm not doing any work with ayahuasca, but there's a group in Melbourne that are, and I know they're trying to figure out, because ayahuasca obviously is traditionally given in a shamanic ceremony, and I know they're trying to figure out, what elements of that to extract. To try and get the most out of these psychotherapies, of this modality as well. But I mean, that's one of the reasons why I'm here today. I think it's really important to listen to all of the rich experiences that have gone before us and really learn from those as well.
Is the concept of mindfulness being used in psychedelic research?
Yeah, so we don't know. So even though we know that this is the set and setting sort of procedure where you have some prep and have some integration and so on, we haven't got a good idea of what the best modality of psychotherapy to deliver is, or whether you should be bothering thinking about any modality at all. By modality, I mean things like motivational interviewing, mindfulness-based therapy. Acceptance commitment therapy, which is essentially mindfulness-based therapy anyway. So there's that. I mean, my sort of feeling, my gut feeling is that mindfulness seems to be really important in this area as a sense of sort of perspective. I mean, the other thing is like, in training to be a therapist as well, I think those kind of personal practices seem to be really important to prepare people to be a therapist in this area as well. And there's sort of a bit of research or a bit of commentary sort of commenting on that as well, and that being a sort of really useful attribute.
Something that I'm curious about, what are your thoughts on the development that's going on compounds that chemically and structurally resemble traditional psychedelics, but these companies are attempting to extract what we would call the psychedelic experience itself from the psychedelic. I don't know if you've heard about some of this research, but I'm curious what your thoughts are on the extraction of this, which would seem to remove things like the mystical experience.
Mm-hmm. I mean, my sense is that you can't. I think it's the mystical experience that's actually mediating the effect. So if you remove that, you'd probably remove the effect as well, in all likelihood. I mean, if you look at what happened with ketamine and S-ketamine that's been recently marketed, there is a real risk around companies tweaking molecules, claiming patents, and then making the drug so expensive that it's actually not accessible to anyone or most of the people that actually need it. And so I think we really need to learn from history here, and that's why I think it's probably important to do the studies using the actual psilocybin and not something that's been chemically tweaked. Like I said at the beginning, the first slide, there's no magic pills or secret bullets to recover from these things. The person that's taking it has to do the work and the psychological work as well. So I don't think a drug company is going to like find a pill that's going to fix everything without having to do the work. And I think that's the thing that's, it's really important to know in this area, in the therapeutic context. You don't just get better. I think it has to, it's good if it happens in a therapeutic framework, and it does take a bit of work.
Yeah, absolutely, and I really appreciate the point on accessibility and patents, because often what we do see is patents lead to price rises in medications, making them less accessible to perhaps the people that need them most, and that's something that we're definitely passionate about here at EGA, and I know Australian Psychedelic Society as well. And I'll just give a quick mention that if you want head across the Australian Psychedelic Society channel, we did do a quick pull apart of the recent announcement of the handing down of a report from the panel that are looking into rescheduling MDMA and psilocybin, just to kind of understand what that's about. But we talked a lot about accessibility there, and a concept known as the missing middle, which you might have heard of, Jonathan, which is about a lack of access that people who are sort of in the middle economic brackets have to mental health treatments. Next question from our YouTube comment section, and thank you to those who have put them in so far. Can you help us imagine the experience from the perspective of a patient in your trial, the set and setting that they would be in, that sort of thing?
Yeah, so what we know about psychedelic trials is that every aspect of the experience of contact with the participant and the study staff and environment is important. Even down to a sort of grumpy receptionist, it may in fact impact on the kind of experience people have. And so we've really tried really hard to get together a fantastic group of therapists and study staff who are really dedicated to producing good research, high quality research, like that has integrity. So getting that cohesive group and getting people well trained to give the participants a good experience was really important. The next thing is, making sure we're doing it very, very safely. And we spent a lot of time thinking about eligibility criteria for that reason. Also, really setting up the therapy room to make sure it gives people a good experience. And so we're lucky in that St Vincent Sydney has been very supportive so far and given us one and probably two rooms to actually do this in. We spent a lot of time thinking about the furniture. We were very lucky in that, like the Melbourne group who are doing the research in cancer spent a lot of time working with a musicologist who's got a PhD in musicology, curating the soundtrack. And actually, we know that the music's really critical to the experience as well. And so taking people on a journey that sort of mirrors the pharmacokinetics of the psilocybin as well. So they've, I think that really helps sort of get the best outcome. But the journey would be, you come in for, we give you a buzz on the phone to see if you're eligible. You come in for 3 separate visits with, a nurse, then myself, and then a psychiatrist. And then we give you the thumbs up, and then you probably have met the therapist before then you have some therapy with them. And then when everyone's happy, you come into the dosing room and have your dose, sit there for 8 hours, having your psychedelic experience. And then, we help you with integration afterwards. And then because they're all recruited from the stimulant treatment program, the aim is to get them, really reintegrate them back into the program with therapists.
Thank you. Sorry. Next question. Sorry, I just had a quick audio problem, but you can hear me now, Jonathan?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, good. if I shouldn't have mentioned it, is methamphetamine addiction expected to respond similarly to alcoholism and treating alcoholism, or what sorts of differences are being considered in treating methamphetamine addiction?
Yeah, well, I mean, the simple answer is I hope so. The reason for that is that a lot of the studies that have shown this response have sort of shown that it's probably transdiagnostic, like I said, and there's like multiple things underlying these conditions that are related to, like, like I say, like disconnection socially, negative self-perception, those kind of things that are really, the thread runs through all addictions, so alcohol and methamphetamine, probably because there's common causes and then common effects because of the effects of addictions on people's lives. The reason why methamphetamine might be unique is because, there may be some dose blunting because of obviously because methamphetamine also acts at serotonin receptors. We've been super cautious around this risk of psychosis. So we know a lot of people seeking treatment for methamphetamine have actually had a history of that. So we're trying to exclude them initially and see how things go. And then really, as down the track, think about really sort of loosening our eligibility criteria so they're not so restrictive, to try and make sure we're offering this to as many people as we can, if it is effective. And I think that what I really want to emphasize is we don't know. And that's the reason we're doing the trial. And I think in this area, it's really, really important to maintain equipoise, because we want to be, we want to maintain integrity scientifically, and so we don't know until we've tried.
And how were your clinicians who are performing the study trained for the methamphetamine use disorder study? Sort of. Yeah,
so we had a lot of support from the Melbourne group again. In fact, before COVID happened, we'd had this beautiful retreat booked to a yoga retreat where we were going to spend lots of time hanging out together, doing yoga and sitting in a sauna together, etc. But there's for a bit of bonding. But sadly, it didn't happen. But what we did was we were able to do a fairly intensive face-to-face teaching over a few days, where we got people like Bill Richards and Peter Hendricks and a few other really big names to zoom in and give us some talks on that. And a lot of experiential work as well. Sadly, we couldn't do experiential work with actual psychedelics because it's still illegal. But there are talks of trials being set up to allow that in a trial setting to train therapists like that. But that's still in the sort of fairly early stages, I think. Then, there's with every trial, there's a bunch of education you need to do around, particularly trial with psychotherapy. There's a bunch of education you need to do around psychotherapy. There's a bunch of stuff you need to do around the trial design and study processes. And they're just a really fantastic group of people we've got as therapists. They're all very compassionate, patient-centered people that I think are going to be excellent. So and they're all pretty well bonded now. So we're very lucky to have them.
There's a lot of areas that psychedelic research is showing a lot of promise and potential for. Treatment of addiction, as you're working with, or dependence being maybe the preferable terminology there. Anxiety, depression, as St Vincent's Hospital in Melbourne are working on, and maybe also a variety of different traumas as well. Do you have any hunches as a researcher of any future areas that might not quite be unveiled yet for psychedelic treatment to enter?
Right. There's a bunch of other areas. I think anything. Look, just think of anything where you have social disconnection, self. Rumination, self-referential thoughts, really unhelpful thoughts about yourself and the world. Think of, it's the root of a lot of modern day distress, isn't it? But things like overeating syndrome or binge eating syndrome, eating disorders in general, anorexia nervosa. I think it's potentially got a lot of promise in those areas. Behavioral addictions, I think, potentially it's got applications to those areas as well. So, thinking about, just open the DSM. I mean, I think the areas where we require a bit more caution is obviously areas where disorders that involve psychosis, because of risks around that. But maybe sometime down the track, that's people are going to look at those as well, or various aspects of those. So I think the key is we're at the early stage here, and we've really got to be careful, have scientific integrity, and really not rush things to the detriment of the integrity and public perception. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone who's left their comments in the YouTube comment section. We've probably got time for just a couple more, so if you want to ask something to Dr. Jonathan Brett, who is here with us tonight talking about treating methamphetamine dependence using psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy, which is PAP, people and their acronyms. Just if you are using an acronym, it's always preferable, I would say, to put the whole term in and then put your acronym in brackets beside it. It's really good practice to to get involved with. But yes, thank you everyone who has been dropping those questions in for Jonathan tonight. I'm just having a look. Do we? Just a quick one from Dr. Stephen Bright. Do patients stay overnight during the clinical therapy?
No, they don't, because I know they do for MDMA, but for psilocybin psychotherapy, they don't. What we do make sure of is really at the get-go that they've got a support person that can come pick them up and take them home and support them, for 24 hours after their dose. So pretty much most of the modern studies these days looking at psilocybin psychotherapy, people don't stay overnight. I think what's going to be really interesting in the near future is us picking apart, what's been sort of a hangover of things that people have done for a very long time. We might be able to sort of start picking that apart and thinking about what's really necessary and what might not be necessary. For example, it probably is necessary to have a therapist dyad during the dosing day, just for practical reasons, but is it necessary to have a therapist dyad for all your other therapy sessions? Or, is it okay to just meet, have a lead therapist and just meet sort of a co-therapist for one prep session, So I think we're going to start to sort of pick apart what are the important elements and try and sort of maybe put to bed some historical things that really aren't necessary. Yeah.
Is there an opportunity for anthropologists who are specializing in studies of health, healing and medicine to get involved with the psychedelic research settings?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question as well. So, I think these early studies, they all benefit from some qualitative aspects, really trying to drill down, because sometimes surveys just don't cut the mustard. So really trying to drill down on people's experiences and if they are transformative, like how and why. So anthropology would be interesting, I guess, because it kind of goes even deeper than that. And, I really like that thought because, we think about addiction not just as a brain disorder, but also in the context of society as well. And, I think when you're thinking about these things and how they're acting, it would be very interesting to see how it changes people's, how it changes them in society as well, if it does change them at all. So I think Yeah, I mean, it'd be super interesting. I'm not an anthropologist, I don't know how you do it, but I'd be interested in the idea.
So for our anthropologists in the audience, get your ideas out there. In comparison with other forms of treating addiction, and I know a lot of that is purely sort of psychological processes, why might psychedelics be attractive to those other forms?
Yeah, well, I mean, first thing to say is the treatments we've got for addiction aren't great. The outcomes aren't great, and we could definitely do better. I suppose the other thing that's really appealing about this area is that it's a real synergy between psychotherapy and pharmacology, and in fact, it really is. I see it as kind of enhancing psychotherapy. So historically, when we've thought about studies in mental health and addiction, they've been quite siloed. We've either looked at the drug and kind of like added on a bit of psychotherapy as an afterthought, or we've looked, in depth at psychotherapy and really not thought about the pharmacological aspect of things. But this is potentially a really nice synergy between the two in an area where there's a really sort of high unmet treatment need.
For those interested in the sort of regulatory process, our regulator, the TGA, what sorts of changes could the Therapeutic Goods Administration, there's another acronym, the Therapeutic Goods Administration (TGA), make that would make it easier for you to do your research and be of a benefit to the community at large?
Right, yeah. So, as people are probably aware, the TGA, the scheduling committee of the TGA are due to make an announcement, I think early November actually, based on the report that was recently commissioned, which was, quite positive. I've got no idea which way that's going to go. So obviously currently it's a Schedule 9. To do macrodosing studies, it actually doesn't make a great deal of difference to me. Because Schedule 8, Schedule 9, you're still really subject to the same, the same restrictions in how you sort of import and store it. There's a few more hoops to jump through with Schedule 9 in terms of licenses to export and licenses to import on a federal and state level. But actually, I have to say, it's really not been that hard to obtain which is very similar to a Schedule 8 pharmacy. That these medicines are dispensed from, if it is a Schedule 9, and it means that if it's a Schedule 9, it can't be really in the hands of the participants at any point. If it's rescheduled to a Schedule 8, then there might be some more flexibility there. People might be allowed to take some home with them, for example. I mean, that's probably the major consideration. I think the other thing to just bear in mind is the TGA may reschedule to Schedule 8, but it's then still subject to all the states' interpretations of the Poisons Act, and all. There may be a whole raft of more regulations and more things you've got to do to actually get access to this drug, and medicinal cannabis is a good example of that.
Yeah, and as I mentioned before, I'll just do one last quick plug for this, which was I'll get. In fact, I'll just post that in the comments section now. If you want to read a little bit more about the MDMA and psilocybin rescheduling, we've got a video there. That's with Dr. Stephen Bright from PRISM and a few people from the Australian Psychedelics Society. And I've just pulled it apart. I've been following TGA things for best part of a decade, and although I have no qualifications in the area, it's certainly something I've read enough about and spoken to the people who do know what they're talking about that I think I can pull these things apart now. I think this might be nearing our last question now, Jonathan, and thank you very much for taking all of these questions tonight. How safe do you see psilocybin relative to other psychedelics and or other illicit substances that are currently in that highly scheduled part of TGA's scheduling? And who should be dispensing such drugs if there were to be a change?
Yeah, well, look, it's a good question as well. I mean, So there's an addiction specialist in Victoria called Imon Bonomo, who kind of replicated a piece of work by David Nutt, who got a kind of bunch of experts together and had a consensus in ranking, how harmful drugs were to the person using and to society. And the number one was alcohol, and number two, I think in Australia, was methamphetamine. Things like MDMA and psychedelics were like way down, in the teens to 20s of like how harmful they were. So I think that the thing to mention here is that in all the trials and all the therapeutic settings, there've been little to no adverse safety signals. So I think done in supported environments, I think is essential that you address those things. That's the kind of key to safety in this area. I feel like there's some of the parts of that question I haven't answered. No, I think that was fine. I think we've got. I think this is our final question now, and a good question for setting, especially since a lot of people in the sort of more recreational or intentional use of psilocybin and other psychedelics are doing when they're setting their setting. Do you foresee a future of psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy outside of the clinic, such as in nature amongst trees and bushland? Oh, wouldn't that be lovely? Yeah, wouldn't that be lovely? So probably not in the near future, but who knows? I guess I guess the near future, like I've said, there's a real need to play by the book and to maintain research integrity and really do it in the safest possible environments, and really show it does or doesn't work in that environment, and then we can start adjusting all those little variables like I talked about. Like I said, there's so many things that we could change or modify with this treatment modality. Sure, I mean, like I say, the dose or the number of doses, but the context that we give it could be modified as well. And I think as long as we're happy that it's going to be safe, I think it would be an interesting thing to look at down the track.
Thank you for taking all of these questions tonight, Jonathan. Maybe we can just finish up before saying thank you tonight with your ideal. What would your ideal scenario be if you could have...
For mental health disorders and addiction, and actually treatments getting to the people who actually need it. So safe and affordable treatments to treat these conditions. So hopefully, there is as much promise in this area as we hope there is.
Thank you very much for taking all of our questions tonight, Jonathan, and leading us through a bit of a summary of the sort of research that you're doing. And I hope we can catch up with you in the future to hear how things are going and what successes you've had, maybe what challenges have been put up as well, because this is science and we want to hear all aspects of it. The good, the bad, and go. Seems to be happening again now. I'm not sure. I'm not sure we can fix that, unfortunately. Before we move on to our next section of tonight's webcast, I just want to quickly mention again our 2021. This is coming up in December. This is our webcast that will be on. It's also a fundraiser leading up to the a fundraiser for all the projects that EGA has been involved with. And here's a few of the speakers that will be speaking at the webcast in December. You can register for it now at the EGA website. And everybody who has a ticket to the now 2022 in-person event will also receive a free invite for that event. And at this stage, the 2022 conference will be an in-person. I don't think we're going to be stopped again. These are just some of the speakers that you'll be seeing in person at that event. Huge range. And I think there will be more announcements about exactly when everything is going on and more about that event coming up. All you have to do is sign up for the newsletter, EGA newsletter, which you can also do at the website entheogenesis/connect, and you can subscribe to the mailing list by filling in this thing. And we're just going to go to a quick snippet from the Yarra Drug and Health Forum, since we've been speaking about dependence issues tonight. One of the ways that people who do struggle with dependence, or people who just generally use drugs and need good information about staying safe, is they engage with peer-based organisations, and this is Sione Crawford, the Executive Officer of Harm Reduction Victoria, speaking about the importance of peer work.
One of the core values of peer work is the engagement that we can undertake in a range of settings. I think it's worth underlining the fact that the sort of work we're talking about is really about keeping a particular cohort of people alive while they wait for the AOD sector, the criminal justice sector, the mental health system to sort itself out, really. Peer workers really need really close relationship with clinicians such as nurses, and to be able to work really closely with them. So there is a limit, so there is not a gap. And one of the key things that we keep coming back to in this is that the waiting lists and the gaps between wanting to make a change or make some or get some help in some way and then being able to actually access it are just too long in our system. And for our cohort and the people that we're working with, it continually bounces them off the system.
And our final session tonight, thank you for those of you who have continued to stay with us tonight on our 9th webcast. You can sign up for the 10th one, which will be in about a month's time at the EGA website. But our final one tonight is the Coke bottle tech terrarium technique. For those of you who have a Coke bottle, this is a can. This is not what you need. It needs to be a bottle. So sorry for the poor example there, but it's what I have on my desk. Geez, I just thought we're just giving a sneaky plug. It doesn't have to be Coke bottle. It can be any kind of plastic bottle. Just trying to not give product placement to the most product placed company in the world. EGA's new guide, which you can find at the resources section of the website, is a guide to the Coke bottle terrarium technique, documenting a simple, innovative and recyclable way of growing plants from seed. The plastic bottle tech is a modification of the famous takeaway tech, which uses a set and forget technique, allowing plants to become more established with less human intervention, better preparing them for outdoor, in-ground environments and reducing the need for up-potting. The plastic bottle tech also represents a more recyclable and environmentally friendly alternative to the takeaway tech, and it's brought to you by Dr. Liam Engel, an adjunct research fellow at Edith Cowan University School of Medical and Health Sciences, research officer at RMIT's Social and Global Studies Centre. Dr. Engel is a drug science communicator with interests spanning digital society, psychedelics, harm reduction, and ecology. Liam is a regular EGA contributor. If you have been a regular EGA webcast watcher, then you will definitely be familiar with his face, and I'll hand it over to Liam now.
If you've heard of takeaway tech, Coke bottle tech is just like that, but better. Of course, people have used plastic bottles to grow plants in various ways for ages, but the Coke bottle tech, as described in the resource, is a design of Halcyon. I met Halcyon through the essay. Bottles were a weirdly frequent conversation topic for Halcyon and I. Halcyon also introduced me to the Damascus Gardens and their Carer St Paul, which featured in the San Pedro Australiana video Entheo TV published earlier this year. I'm going to sow some seed I collected from there in a sec as I take you through the Coke bottle technique. Anyway, Halcyon has an ability to propagate breed, and identify plants like very few people I've ever met. Has named a variety of cool plants and creatures, and is just an all-round amazing, compassionate plant science human. So thanks Halcyon for putting the work into coming up with this bottle tech design. It took me a couple of years of experimenting to arrive at my standard model, and I've experimented their performance for about 2 years now. The Coke bottle tech came from wanting to improve the takeaway tech. I had some that had worked well, some that had done poorly, and some that had failed outright. I wanted to have a much deeper soil layer, as well as much more space above the soil layer. I also knew I wanted to incorporate the hole in the side water reservoir that I'd already devised with much success for glass terrariums. I experimented with many different plastic bottles and containers, until I started sliding Coke bottles into Pepsi bottles. After a while, I found the base of the Coke bottle slid out when I'd pick it up from the top. One experiment, when I paired 2 Coke bottles together, completely overcame that problem, so I stuck with that design and have only ever modified the reservoir depth since then. I've now seen that the concept will work with just about any bottle that has a groove in the wall. The groove is essential for making 2 opposing flanges lock together when the bottle is turned upside down. But my favourite bottle, for many reasons, is a 2-litre Coke bottle, so I recommend starting with them. People should experiment with whatever they can possibly conceive of, and all those things will become apparent when you start making the bottles. I do find the more care or effort you put in, the more you'll get out, so avoid shortcuts. My failures have only ever come from overheating in direct sun, so they must be used under shade cloth. Also, I once found a bottle that was completely full of water, as I'd forgotten to poke holes in that particular bottle. Every plant I've tried so far has worked. I fertilise with slow-release Osmocote or liquid fertilisers like Powerfeed and Sea Sol. I do recommend experimenting with soil mixes, and I've noticed if the underwater reservoir layer is gravel, cacti roots can only just tap into it. But if it's organic, the cacti roots go right through it, and they get tangled up a bit. So both options have their pros and cons. However, I do like always adding some activated charcoal to that subaquatic layer to protect against nasty anaerobic conditions. So I've had a few failures so far in trying to cut these bottles to make a video about how to actually do it. Well, I failed once, technically. Failed here. Not only did I fail being able to make this flange interlock so the lid doesn't come out like it just did, when I was trying to demonstrate how you can also just press it down, even though it's not convenient because it pushes on the medium, I, as you can see, crushed the bottle and undermined some of the structural integrity. So that was the official failure. And the unofficial failure was I did pretty much the exact same thing without the glory of crushing the bottle when I made this one for the actual resource document. I'm going to try a third time. Here's hoping I don't fail again. We will begin. So first I'm going to put kind of at the peak of each of these kind of lumps, I'm going to put a hole going all the way around the outside, the reservoir holes. Sweet. And then I'm going to put one here at the top, and that is what I'm going to use to allow my scissors to enter. And then the main tip for this is cutting on the bottom side, and that way it's kind of easier to see where you're cutting and to keep a straight line. On the top kind of gets a bit mangly, so and of course so you don't do what I've done in those other failed times. I'm going to cut it more high than I need to so I can trim it down later in the hopes of reducing the chance of messing this up. Cool, so that's much too high, but that's good. Now we can cut it down, right? And I think I'm just aiming, I don't even want to tell you how many millimeters or centimeters because it will change depending on the bottle. But you just want enough overhang after the flange so something will lock in there, but not so much that something won't fit. We'll see in a moment how that goes. So, and this is going to be the top of the terrarium. Obviously, this is going to be the bottom of the terrarium. And this one, we don't need any holes except for one hole to get in there with our scissors. And we're going to cut that same concept just above the flange, hopefully enough to lock in. And better to overcut than undercut. And so we'll overcut this one and show you how it doesn't quite fit in, I'm imagining. You and myself that overcut, not undercut. I thought I would have to trim that, and I didn't even need to. I'm a little bit shocked. Well, not shocked. I do this all the time. This is great. Okay. I'm going to get some kind of wood chips or wood-based compost or wood debris of some sort. I got this stuff this is what was sieved at the bottom of really cheap potting mix. So we're going to chuck that in there. And we're going to get this to just above those holes we put in. Yeah? Cool. Looks about right. We're going to 50-50 washed sand with I don't know, whatever the gardening place had. Sand isn't the best. It is good drainage, but doesn't have heaps of nutrients. But anyway, does the job. So I'm going to chuck this in here. That looks pretty good. And then I'll put on some seed. Normally I'd put on a layer of like zeolite or washed sand over the top, but I don't have any of that. I get annoyed and I put too much water in it. But that is the beauty of this design is unlike the takeaway tech where you have to be quite specific with how much water you put in it because it doesn't drain. This will just drain itself. I just didn't want to sit here for 5 minutes. Just a bit excited with how well that locks in. And then, I've wet my seeds. But these are those Damascus seeds. And I am going to put what I am roughly estimating as, well, I probably should put 50 in there, but as you can see, I've got too many. So I'm going to do like 100 or so. And I often would put a layer of zeolite or sand at the top there, but I don't have any zeolite or sand. Oh, by the way, this can just grow. But I'm also going to write a label on here because that's what you do, so you don't forget. Sec for 2 and it's cheap and easy and awesome. Cactus. So I'm going to show you what my setup has been for raising seedlings. I used the Coke bottle tech, as you can see, picked up by the lid very easily when it's cut right. And this is in a box, and I've cut a bit out of the lid, and I've put fluorescent T5 light on the top of it and spray painted the inside of the box white to increase reflection. And here are some of my Coke bottle techs, and they're not all perfect. You'll see this one, the lid hasn't been done right, so if I pick it up from the lid, it's going to come right off, and that's in no way ideal. But this one, not a problem, and I have to use the right technique to get it off, which you can see this is probably a little bit overgrown. Bit of work there.
for Safeguarding the Genetic Diversity of Psilocybes, featuring Dr. Alistair McTaggart, with a Q&A session to follow. That's happening on Wednesday the 24th of November from 8 p.m, and you can sign